In 1955, the Hollywood industry was at a critical turning point. Like we've already intimated in our other videos from this time period, television was stealing audiences from theaters, and studios were desperate to win them back with spectacular productions, colorful cinemascope epics, biblical dramas, and star-driven vehicles were Hollywood's weapons against the small-screen invasion. But for every hit like Rebel Without a Cause or Lady and the Tramp, there were expensive gambles that crashed and burned, leaving studios hemorrhaging money. The film business has always been unpredictable, but the mid-50s seemed especially brutal for projects that missed the mark. Let's dive straight into it and talk about the 13 biggest box office disasters from 1955 that made Hollywood executives beg their bosses for forgiveness. Universal Pictures thought they had the perfect formula for success, a provocative historical tale starring the gorgeous Maureen O'Hara as Lady Godiva, the noble woman famous for riding naked through town. But this lavish period piece quickly became a cautionary tale in Hollywood. Director Arthur Lubin was essentially forced to make the film, later calling it a bad picture when the studio threatened him with suspension if he refused. The film suffered from multiple issues. A disjointed script filled with feuding nobles that audiences found tedious and unconvincing performances. Perhaps most disappointing for the marketing department was the extremely tame portrayal of the famous nude ride. O'Hara wore a flesh-colored bodysuit and was heavily draped with her long hair. Despite the presence of a young Clint Eastwood in an uncredited role, critics panned the film as ponderous and dull. The spectacular set pieces and elaborate costumes couldn't save this misconceived historical drama from becoming one of Universal's biggest disappointments of 1955. If there's one film that exemplifies Howard Hughes' peculiar approach to filmmaking, it's RKO's Son of Sinbad. This adventure, starring Dale Robertson and Vincent Price, was filmed in 1953, but shelved for 2 years due to issues with the Motion Picture Production Code. When it finally hit theaters in 1955, audiences quickly realized why censors had been concerned. Hughes, the eccentric billionaire who owned RKO, essentially turned the film into a showcase for scantily clad women. The movie reportedly featured 127 young actresses in revealing harem outfits, including famous burlesque performer Lily St. Cyr. Vincent Price, who played the poet Omar Khayyam, brought charisma to the role, but even his talents couldn't elevate this transparent excuse for showcasing female flesh. The Catholic Legion of Decency condemned the film a month before its release, but even secular critics found it lacking. The film's commercial failure contributed to the studio's financial troubles, with RKO Pictures ultimately being dismantled shortly after this costly misstep. Son of Sinbad represents the twilight of Hughes' Hollywood empire, a gaudy failure that prioritized the producer's obsessions over audience appeal. Kirk Douglas was one of Hollywood's most bankable stars in the mid-1950s, but even his charisma couldn't save the racers from skidding off the track. This expensive European racing drama, directed by Henry Hathaway, was 20th Century Fox's attempt to cash in on the glamorous world of Grand Prix racing, but it ended up burning through its considerable budget. The film starred Douglas as Gino Borghese, an ambitious Italian bus driver determined to become a champion race car driver. Shot on location at famous European circuits including Monaco, Monza, and Nürburgring, the production spared no expense in capturing authentic racing action. However, the compelling racing footage was undermined by unconvincing rear projection shots. Critics noted that the story essentially recycled Douglas's earlier boxing drama, Champion, but with less success. His character's single-minded pursuit of victory at the expense of relationships felt derivative rather than compelling. The romantic subplot with actress Bella Darby failed to generate any heat. Despite the impressive European locations and thrilling race sequences, the racers crashed at the box office, making it one of the least remembered entries in Douglas's filmography. The film's failure demonstrated that even combining a major star with exotic locations wasn't enough without a resonant story. When your promotional strategy involves holding an underwater premiere where journalists are expected to watch the film in scuba gear, you might be compensating for something. RKO's Underwater, starring Jane Russell and Richard Egan, was Howard Hughes' expensive gamble on a treasure-hunting adventure that failed to find gold at the box office. The film, which cost a staggering $3 million to produce, was conceived as a showcase for Russell's famous physique in swimsuit scenes. Hughes was so obsessed with marketing Russell's curves that the promotional campaign centered almost entirely on her red bathing suit, which actually appears only briefly. Underwater follows treasure hunters searching for a sunken Spanish galleon carrying a golden Madonna statue. While the underwater cinematography was impressive for its time, The plot was derivative and the performances lackluster. Russell inexplicably adopted and then abandoned a Spanish accent throughout the film. The infamous underwater premiere in Silver Springs, Florida, became a disaster itself when the projection equipment malfunctioned, Richard Egan reportedly got drunk, and Russell stormed out. The film's failure contributed to RKO's financial woes and stands as a testament to Hughes's poor judgment in prioritizing gimmicks over substance. MGM thought they had the perfect formula for success when they cast swimming sensation Esther Williams in Jupiter's Darling, a musical comedy set in ancient Rome. But this bizarre hybrid of historical epic and aquatic musical sank spectacularly at the box office, losing the studio a shocking $2,232,000, one of the biggest financial disasters in MGM's history. The premise was certainly unique. Williams played Amytas, a Roman noblewoman who falls for Hannibal, Howard Keel, as he's about to invade Rome, and somehow teaches him to swim along the way. The film featured elaborate underwater ballet sequences, including one where Williams swims with statues that come to life. Production problems plagued the film from the start. Williams suffered a punctured eardrum during filming, limiting her underwater work and requiring a body double for many scenes. Director George Sidney reportedly delayed production by 3 months due to personal issues. Critics were merciless, with Time magazine dismissing it with the observation that Esther Williams' pictures are generally so much water over the dame. Audiences stayed away, making Jupiter's Darling Williams' first and only box office flop at MGM. The financial disaster effectively ended her reign as the studio's aquatic queen. MGM's Kismet seemed like a guaranteed hit on paper. Based on a successful Broadway musical with music adapted from composer Alexander Borodin's romantic classical pieces, starring the reliable Howard Keel fresh from his success in Seven Brides for Seven Brothers, and filmed in glorious Technicolor and CinemaScope, what could possibly go wrong? As it turned out, everything. This lavish tale of a poet beggar in ancient Baghdad who rises to prominence through a series of unlikely events was directed by Vincente Minnelli, but even his visual flair couldn't save the production from feeling stilted and lifeless. The Orientalist fantasy that had worked on stage felt hopelessly artificial on screen. Keel, who had demonstrated his musical talents in numerous MGM hits, seemed uncomfortable in the role of the crafty poet Hodge. The songs that had enchanted Broadway audiences failed to translate to film, lacking the energy and charm necessary to sell the exotic setting. Production costs ballooned as MGM spared no expense on elaborate sets, costumes, and dance sequences. The film's failure at the box office was part of a larger pattern of MGM musical flops in 1955, signaling the beginning of the end for the studio's dominance in the genre. It's Always Fair Weather was meant to be a triumphant reunion of the creative team behind On the Town, directors Gene Kelly and Stanley Donen, along with writers Betty Comden and Adolph Green. Instead, it became one of MGM's most painful commercial failures of 1955 and signaled the beginning of the end for the studio's golden age of musicals. The film was innovative in many respects, using CinemaScope brilliantly for dance sequences, including Kelly's famous routine on roller skates. It told a surprisingly cynical story for a musical, following 3 war buddies who reunite after 10 years only to discover they have nothing in common anymore. Behind the scenes, the production was troubled by a deteriorating relationship between co-directors Kelly and Donen. Their creative partnership, which had produced some of Hollywood's greatest musicals, was falling apart during filming. The tension reportedly led to an increasingly toxic atmosphere. Despite impressive dance sequences and intelligent songs, It's Always Fair Weather failed to connect with audiences who were turning away from movie musicals. The film's commercial failure was especially painful because critics actually praised its artistic merits. Its failure contributed to MGM's decision to scale back musical production, effectively ending an era in Hollywood. 20th Century Fox had good reason to believe A Man Called Peter would be a success in 1955. Religious films were performing well at the box office, and this biopic about Scottish-American preacher Peter Marshall seemed like a safe bet, directed by Henry Koster, who had previously delivered the hit The Robe. The film starred Richard Todd as the charismatic minister who became chaplain of the United States Senate. Despite its inspiring source material and solid production values, A Man Called Peter failed to ignite audience interest. The film's reverent approach may have been its undoing. While respectful, it lacked the dramatic tension and spectacle that had made other religious films of the era successful. Fox had invested heavily in the production, filming in CinemaScope and Technicolor to give the project prestige. But these expensive enhancements couldn't compensate for the fundamental lack of excitement in the storytelling. Todd delivered Marshall's sermons with conviction, but the film struggled to make the minister's life story compelling. The commercial disappointment of A Man Called Peter stood out because it bucked the trend of successful religious films in the mid-1950s. Its failure demonstrated that even in a seemingly reliable genre, audience interest could not be taken for granted. Columbia Pictures had high hopes for My Sister Eileen, a musical remake of their own successful 1942 comedy, but their decision to bypass the popular songs from the Broadway musical Wonderful Town, based on the same source material, would prove financially disastrous, resulting in one of the year's most disappointing box office performers. The film starred Janet Leigh and Betty Garrett as sisters who moved to New York's Greenwich Village, with Jack Lemmon in an early role as a magazine editor behind the scenes. The production faced numerous challenges. Judy Holliday was originally cast but dropped out due to contract disputes. Her replacement, Betty Garrett, was returning after being unofficially blacklisted. The biggest misstep was Columbia's decision not to use Leonard Bernstein's music and Betty Comden and Adolph Green's lyrics from Wonderful Town. When the rights proved too expensive, studio head Harry Cohn hired Jules Stein and Leo Robin to write a new score. The resulting songs were serviceable but unmemorable. My Sister Eileen failed to recoup its considerable investment, joining the long list of musical disappointments in 1955. Its failure demonstrated the risks of tampering with successful formulas and cutting corners on key creative elements like music in a musical film. When you pair Clark Gable and Jane Russell in a Western directed by veteran filmmaker Raoul Walsh, box office success seems like a foregone conclusion. Yet 20th Century Fox's The Tall Men became one of the more puzzling commercial disappointments of 1955, failing to recoup its substantial budget despite its impressive star power. The film was a sweeping cattle drive epic with Gable and Russell caught in a love triangle with Robert Ryan. Shot in CinemaScope and on location in Mexico, the production was lavish and expensive. Fox expected the combination of two massive stars and spectacular Western vistas would guarantee a hit. While the film wasn't a catastrophic failure on the level of some other 1955 disasters, its underwhelming performance was particularly concerning given the caliber of talent involved. Gable's drawing power appeared to be waning, though he was still commanding top-tier salaries. The Western genre was becoming increasingly crowded, with television Westerns siphoning off audience interest. The Tall Men has been largely forgotten today, overshadowed by more successful Westerns of the era. Its failure demonstrated that even the biggest stars couldn't guarantee success if the material failed to offer something fresh to audiences increasingly selective about their entertainment choices. MGM's The Prodigal represents one of the most expensive miscalculations in the studio's history. This lavish biblical epic starring Lana Turner and Edmund Purdom cost a fortune to produce, but became what studio executive Dor Sherry later called the biggest and most embarrassing failure of his time at MGM, losing $771,000. Loosely based on the biblical parable of the prodigal son, the film expanded the simple tale into a sprawling spectacle filled with pagan rituals, exotic dancing, and Lana Turner as Samara, a temple priestess wearing provocative costumes. The studio was clearly trying to combine religious themes with sex appeal, a strategy that backfired spectacularly. Turner herself hated making the film, later writing in her autobiography, "My lines were so stupid I hated to go to work in the morning." Her co-star Edmund Purdom, who had replaced Marlon Brando in The Egyptian the previous year, found himself in back-to-back biblical flops that effectively ended his chances at Hollywood stardom. Critics were merciless, dismissing the film as overblown and poorly written. Audiences who came for religious inspiration were put off by the film's thinly veiled eroticism, while those attracted by Turner's revealing costumes found the religious, moralizing tedious. The infamous vulture attack sequence has since become a source of unintentional comedy for film buffs. Howard Hawks was one of Hollywood's most consistent directors, with hits spanning multiple genres, but Land of the Pharaohs became his first major box office failure and temporarily derailed his stellar career. This epic about the building of the Great Pyramid cost Warner Bros. $3.15 million, but fell $450,000 short of breaking even, a significant loss in 1955 dollars. The production was enormously ambitious, with Hawks reportedly employing nearly 10,000 extras for certain scenes the director spent lavishly to create authentic-looking ancient Egyptian settings, working with Nobel Prize-winning author William Faulkner on the screenplay. But despite the impressive scope, the film never connected with audiences. A young Joan Collins as the scheming Nelifer brought energy to the production, but the dialogue was stilted and unconvincing. Faulkner later defended himself against criticism by saying, "I didn't know how ancient Egyptians spoke." The film's financial failure hit Hawks hard. He took a 4-year hiatus from filmmaking afterward, traveling Europe before returning with Rio Bravo in 1959. What makes Land of the Pharaohs particularly interesting is its subsequent critical reappraisal. Martin Scorsese has named it one of his favorite films, and many critics now appreciate its visual grandeur. Paul Newman's film debut stands as one of Hollywood's most notorious misfires, a biblical epic so bad that Newman himself later took out ads in trade publications apologizing for his performance when the film aired on television. The Silver Chalice was Warner Brothers' attempt to capitalize on the success of religious epics, but instead, it became a legendary disaster that nearly ended Newman's career before it properly began. The film cast Newman as Basil, a Greek artisan commissioned to create a silver chalice to house the cup used by Christ at the Last Supper shot in CinemaScope. The production featured bizarre, modernist sets that looked more like a contemporary art installation than ancient Rome. These stylized backgrounds created a jarring visual disconnect that confused and alienated viewers. Newman later described his performance as wooden and amateurish, a self-assessment many critics shared. His discomfort is visible throughout the film, as he struggles with the stilted dialogue. Co-star Jack Palance chewed the scenery as Simon the Magician, but even his energetic performance couldn't save the misconceived production. Unlike some other flops from 1955 that have faded into obscurity, The Silver Chalice has achieved lasting fame as a spectacular failure. Its reputation was cemented when Newman publicly distanced himself from the film. The Silver Chalice serves as a reminder that even the greatest actors sometimes begin their careers with embarrassing missteps. The box office disasters of 1955 tell us much about a Hollywood industry in transition. Studios were taking expensive gambles to combat television's growing popularity. But many of these lavish productions missed the mark in spectacular fashion. Biblical epics with risque elements, underwater adventures, racing films, and splashy musicals all failed to connect with audiences despite enormous budgets and star power. For some studios, like RKO, these failures contributed to their eventual demise. For others, like MGM, they signaled the end of an era of dominance in certain genres. Even individual careers were affected. Howard Hawks took a 4-year break from filmmaking after his flop, while Esther Williams ended her long relationship with MGM. Yet there's something fascinating about these magnificent failures. Many have developed cult followings over the years, appreciated for their excesses, their misjudgments, and occasionally their unrecognized virtues. Films like Land of the Pharaohs and It's Always Fair Weather have been critically reassessed, while others like The Silver Chalice remain legendary for their sheer awfulness. These 13 box office disasters remind us that filmmaking has always been a high-risk enterprise, where enormous talent and resources provide no guarantee of success. In the unpredictable world of Hollywood, sometimes the biggest failures make for the most interesting stories, cautionary tales of ambition, miscalculation, and spectacular financial ruin that continue to fascinate film buffs decades after they first disappointed at the box office.